defining hard rules versus soft rules. This is a good one. This isn't really specific to Automate DB, actually. I do like this question. And it's an age-old question about how much really, at what point does a transformation or a change to the data become a soft rule? And at one point does it become, is it a hard rule and not a soft rule? Just to clarify to those watching, a hard rule essentially is, and I always get these mixed up in my head because to me the naming's never quite clicked in my head. But what a hard rule is something that essentially transforms the data without changing the meaning of the data. So these can be things like removing white space, trimming, kind of generally cleaning up the data, maybe performing lookups, although that one's a gray area, which we'll get into. And soft rules are essentially where you start really transforming the data. So you might perform a calculation, you might multiply something out, you might start aggregating, joining things up, grouping, that kind of thing. Those generally are soft rules because you're changing the grain of the data, you're changing the ultimate meaning of the data, and the business will make different decisions based on that new meaning. So that's where you get your soft rules. So the question specifically is, where is the line? Is there a definitive line? I'd like to say yes, but different situations, people are going to say different things. So I'll give my opinion here. So he says, basic cleansing, functions like trimming white space, casting data types, standardizing the case upper lower, generally considered acceptable. Are they generally considered acceptable hard rules for the staging area? Are things like composite keys an acceptable hard rule for the staging area? Does this cross into business logic? Very good question. So I'm very much of the opinion that the staging layer standards, you shouldn't be doing any transformation there. You shouldn't even be doing any joining of tables really if you can help it. The only reason we do that with sometimes in Automate is because of the limitation of DBT, where you can't load more than one model into another model because it's all pure SQL. You have to do a union first essentially. And there are ways around that. Now that DBT has UDFs available and things like that, or natively supported UDFs, I should say. We're going to look into potentially getting around that limitation and also using that approach, which would be very interesting. Watch this space. But back to my original point, so trimming, casting, upper, lower, all that kind of stuff. That's considered acceptable in staging because you're not changing the meaning of the data. That's kind of the key point there. You're cleaning up the data so that downstream it's got better processing. Now, whether they have to be in the staging layer is another matter. It depends what that data is going to be doing downstream. So if, for example, you've got a business key where sometimes it's got white space in it, and that's going to affect your joining when it comes to, or at least affect your relationships when it comes to hubs and satellites and things like that, then absolutely, you're going to have to clean that up in staging because otherwise it's going to break your relational integrity between your hubs and satellites, which is your integration layer. If you can't integrate because of silly things like that, essentially, absolutely clean them up. But it should be minimal and it should be considered. You shouldn't just do everything in staging, especially not business logic and pure soft rules, I should say, in the staging layer. That's what your business vault is for, and post raw vaults to optics and satellites. That's where your soft rules should live. Essentially, in my opinion, there is a hard line in terms of what is acceptable in the staging layer, but whether you have to do it in the staging layer is the question. If you can leave it till later, do it later, because that means you are minimizing how much you do to the raw data and you're keeping it as raw as possible. That's the intent of the staging layer, is raw data in, don't do anything to it unless you really have to do the integration downstream. If you can leave it for the marts, put it in the mart, put the soft rule in put the soft rule in the mart, or put the hard rule in the mart. You can leave it to the presentation layer, so you get kind of variation of soft rules, which are presentation rules, which are, you only apply them in the last layer for going to the dashboard or going into your mart essentially. Ultimately, you have to be very careful about audit. So if you have lots of rules in staging, lots of rules in your business vault, and then lots of rules in your presentation layer, it's going to be very difficult to kind of, unless you're very careful with naming and the structure of your project in the case of DBT, it's going to be hard to, or at least harder to track where that data got transformed. Of course, DBT helps with the lineage, and you will be able to work it out, but at a glance, it'll be more difficult, is what I'm trying to say. So I think do as little as possible in staging, keep the data as raw as possible. Do what you can later if you can do it later, and if you do only what you have to do in the raw in the staging layer, in the raw staging layer, to get it ready for audit. Get it ready for the later processing downstream. I say audit there because sometimes you'll need to add your audit columns like load date, record source in staging, and that's you're adding metadata for the downstream processing. That's why we add it in the raw vault, because they are in the raw staging, because they are required for downstream in Hubs and satellites. We would add them later if we could. That's just one example.